get to reflect on things. And there's some, mysteries of the universe that always get me. So this was a shot I took from the flight as we were coming into land 2 days ago. And I thought, oh, what a beautiful shot, and I just took it. And then as we got a little bit closer on approach, I saw some ships there. And little did I know that when I saw these ships and I took this picture, that I had actually solved an age-old mystery. Found them. And this was actually a photo I took from the plane coming in, so this is not something I found online. But the really interesting thing is this really hammered home something that I like to talk about is getting into the details and the minutia of the discussion. One of the problems that I have in media, and I have made this mistake myself in the past, is we don't get to the meat of it. We don't actually discuss what the real problems are as either practitioners or media or together. And I often feel like I'm an old man shouting at the clouds. Go figure, I'm working for a cloud provider. Who saw that coming? And when we're going through the media and we're looking at all these things, they're talking about DDoS, and admittedly DDoS is in the title, but I don't solely stick to that. But these type of attacks are never really gotten into in any sort of detail with regards to the media. And I don't mean to beat up the media, it's one of those disconnects that I want to actually talk to. Because they want you to feel fear. And not because they're malicious by any stretch of the imagination, but they're sitting there going, these are the bad things that are going to get you. And you put in security controls, you may protect, but are you putting in the right security controls? Are you actually defending yourself properly? And this is a perfect example. Is it running? Let's see. So in this particular case, this highlights an issue. This looks like a really scary problem, and the media likes to go on about these sort of things. To my 2-year-old, this is absolutely terrifying, although not a real threat. And the problem I see with fake threats is that we're seeing about this in the media a lot, like dormant cyber pathogens. And thanks to Eddie Mize for putting that graphic together for me. These are things that really concern me because we're losing focus on what the actual problems are, and we're not looking at data from our various platforms. And these stories really left me wanting. So that brings me to being right here. So just to put in case in point, the type of data that we're pulling from our platform, this is a question I already know the answer to, but has anybody in this room not been online in the last 30 days? Exactly. Every one of you is in our logs at some point. That just shows you the breadth and scope of the type of data that we're dealing with. And as a result of having that much data available to us, we can see some really cool things developing. So this is the game plan that I'm going to wander through. I'm going to talk briefly about actors, types of attacks, tools, trends, and where do we take it from here? And all of this is driven based on the data that we've collected. So when I present on certain items, people will say, oh, well, if you're uncertainty node. It's like, no, this is actual raw data with no filters attached. So early on in my career, I came across various types like this online were actors for hire, digital mercenaries, for want of a better term. And I thought, wow, this is pretty neat. And as I went through it, I was looking at the various types of services they would offer for hire. And it was really intriguing to me that they thought they could get away with this. And in some cases, they have. The really good ones don't get caught. But the audacity of these characters really comes through when you look at something like this. Now, this is a part of a menu item that we found online about 3 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago now. So it's a little bit dated. But this is a Russian underground site, and these are the prices that they had put up and for the various services. So if you want to hack into a corporate email box, it'll cost you $500, so on and so forth. But you get right down to it, you look at DDoS botnet, $700. Now, this was 2, maybe 3 years ago, and that price has dropped dramatically, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later on. So the fear that people have with regards to these sort of characters can often be mitigated by positive stuff. Now, this is actually a service that went live roughly a year ago. And when I first did this presentation at NorthSec in Montreal, Quebec, I did this presentation. And by the time the slides were done and about 2 hours after that, this site had been compromised and all of the participants' data had been leaked. So give them points for trying. Unfortunately, it didn't pan out. So this was a service where you could you could sign up and say, I'm available to do pen test on X, Y, and Z, and they would find contract work for you. So the right idea, unfortunate execution, and that really hammers home the problems of blue versus red teams that Dave Kennedy was talking about yesterday. And when you're looking at the types of actors and threats that you have to deal with, one of the most prevalent one, of course, is the bored kids. Now, the bored kids I always have a real problem with, not because of what they're doing, but because they haven't had people taking the time to pull them aside and say, these are real problems. These are things that you need to be concerned about because this could negatively impact you further down the road. And they are looking for, in a lot of cases, a sense of belonging, something that they can be a part of and they can contribute to because, as with any teenager or tween, they're upset, they're angry at the world, they want to find some way that they can actually make a difference or belong to something bigger than themselves. And when they make these decisions and without proper guidance, these decisions can often go horribly wrong. And when these situations go wrong, it can impact them for later years. Just Google David Cameron and pig. Now, these folks were, before we get to this, these kids are a disposable workforce. Because in a lot of the places that these kids live or reside, they tend to be below the age of majority. And if they get caught, most of them get a slap on the hand. A lot of them, that record will not follow them into adulthood. So for a motivated operator, these are a great disposable workforce, and they really don't particularly care if they get caught. Now, the hacktivists are the easiest example because they are splashed across media on a regular basis. Whether or not you agree with their politics, they are very effective at what they do. And the problem that I see when they're calling themselves something like anonymous is it's right up there with Kaiser Sose. Anybody can be this person or character or operator. And it's not necessarily somebody motivated with the best intentions. And when you think about that for a second, you have no idea who you're dealing with. And this could actually really go badly. And it can go even worse when you look at it from the perspective of a nation-state actor. If nation-state actors are in your threat model, then you're dealing with something very serious. If you're building teddy bears, probably not so much. But this is one of those things is, what is the risk to your organization? Are these folks actually a problem for you? And when you're looking at nation-state actors, you've got your standard villains, which are commonly dragged out for the likes of the Sony Pictures, was it Sony Pictures? Yeah, Sony Pictures breach. I still have problem believing it was them. And then right up to your arch villains. And these folks are, they are a real threat to certain folk, certain operations, certain environments. And you really have to actually look at it. What is the risk to your environment? And I hope you appreciate that by virtue of me putting this particular picture up, I've actually broken the law in Russia, and they could actually send me to jail for this one if I ever go there. Oddly enough, not in a rush. So when you're looking at state-sponsored actors, a great example from a few years back are the Al-Qassam cyber fighters. Now, the Al-Qassam cyber fighters were a rather adept organization that ostensibly rolled up under some branch of the Iranian government. This has never been fully unwound, but this seems to be fairly sound in its assessment. These folks were attacking financial institutions all over the United States. Unfortunately, they also attacked organizations in Canada, where I'm from. And I really tried to figure out why they were attacking Canada when they were angry at the United States. And at some point, it actually came out that they did not understand that Canada and the United States were separate because it looked like the same landmass on a map. Awesome. So these folks used a tool called Brobot, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later, but this was a very effective platform that they could actually pivot their attacks within a space of about 5 minutes. So if you were being attacked by vector X and you blocked that vector, they could pivot very quickly to a different way of attacking you. And the thing was, when they said they were going to attack you, they showed up and they did it, unlike the Armada Squad. But we'll talk about that too. So some of the attacks that I'm going to talk about are going to be dealing with volumetric, application layer, as well as protocol-based attacks. Now, by virtue of the fact that we have so much data available to us, when we go through it, we look at the different types of attack vectors. And one of the things that really jumps out at me, especially in this first slide here, is that the top 3 attacks that they have here are local file inclusion, SQL injection, and cross-site scripting. Can anybody tell me how long SQL injection has been on the OWASP top 10? Close enough. I was just going to accept a decade, but 13 years is probably actually accurate. This is a solvable problem, and the attackers are looking for it because it still works. Because applications are getting pushed out to market in a very quick, expeditious fashion. And in a lot of cases, the project managers go out of their way to bypass security. How do I know this? Because I have eaten the souls of so many project managers, it's not funny. Now, when we switch that from looking at TLS over to HTTP, we look at the types of attacks. Again, LFI and SQL injection are right in the top. In this particular case, they have PHP injection, but PHP is such an interesting piece of work. But again, back to the things they're hitting are stuff that are solvable items that if we are doing proper patch management, if we're doing proper configuration management. It's not sexy, but it's so easy for us to do a better job at it as defenders. Now, in addition to these types of things that they're looking for, the types of attacks that we see on a nonstop basis, SYN floods, UDP floods, and the rest, anecdotally on our own platform, we're dropping about 2 terabits of attack traffic continuously. And that's not even the stuff that we log and process. This is just the cruft that we drop. So it's absolutely amazing how much attack traffic is out there on the internet. And we're only a portion of it. At any given point, we're moving about 30% of the internet across our platform. So take that and amplify it out for the rest of the internet. That is a lot of attack traffic. And the vast majority of it really does fall under volumetric-based attacks against infrastructure. And I would have hoped when I put an academic type hat on, not that I'm an academic, that they would be going after stuff like application-based attacks and things like that, where they could get the real meat of it. But I guess volumetric attacks are just that much simpler. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But how many folks in this room know who this character is? Yes, I know it's Sunday, we're almost done. All right, anyway, if anybody knows StarCraft the game, this was a character called the Zerg. And if you were playing this game, you were supposed to build up your resources, build up your weapons and all that sort of thing. And then these characters would show up and destroy everything. Pretty aggravating when you're playing this game, and if you know this game, you know how old I am now. This was an absolute frustrating thing. And this is very much how I envision it when I'm looking at it from the perspective of a denial of service attack. And when I explain it to C-suite types that are of my age or older, it's almost guaranteed that they're going to get this reference. And it's rather funny in that regard. The other reference I use is this. You have a website, it's a fast, gorgeous car, but you can't really do anything if you can't actually have people get to your site or you can't execute on their orders or whatever it happens to be that your company is doing. Now, from the data that we have on our platform, we pull out all the different types of attacks on a quarterly basis. And we provide this for free to whoever wants to use it for whatever purposes you want to use it for. So the latest data that I have that's publicly available at this point, still about a week before we release our Q1 data, which is unfortunate. I was hoping to have it here. This breaks out the various types of attacks and the vector and frequency. This was actually the first quarter, and that's Q4 of 2015, it was the first quarter where we saw SSDP attacks drop precipitously. Every quarter before that, this was actually being used as a denial of service reflector by attackers. Why? Because it worked. It's simple. When you look at all of the home routers that are being plugged in and misconfigured, as a perfect example, almost all of these have universal plug and play as part of their structure. SSDP is a component of that, Simple Service Discovery Protocol. Now, a while back I wrote an article for Forbes about this where I talked about this as being leveraged by attackers. And apparently there's an organization called the Universal Plug and Play Consortium. I didn't know this was an actual beast, but they popped out of the woodwork and they sent me a very nasty email. They wanted me to correct the article saying that Universal Plug and Play was perfectly secure. I said, but data. And they said, no, it's secure. We said so. Apparently, they had lost in the translation that I was actually showing them raw data as opposed to jumping up and down like my hair was on fire. I was actually showing them something empirical. And they still wouldn't back down on that. But this is really how I look at SSDP at this point in time, is really a tool that if it is not implemented correctly, security is not taken into account, this becomes an attack tool. Now, that takes us into application layer-based attacks. These are the attack surfaces that I really expected attackers to be going after more. And as someone who defends companies for a living, I'm happy that they're not. But as someone who sits back and say, well, logically, why are you not doing that? I guess because it's a little bit harder, requires some level of intelligence. These are the attacks that I feel have the biggest bang for the buck. With a denial of service that's just doing a volumetric attack, there are all kinds of ways to help mitigate that sort of attack. With an application-based attack, you want to make sure that, one, you have controls in place, but that you have resilient code. Has your code been reviewed? Do you have any sort of issues in it, like SQL injection? A solvable problem, although it keeps popping up. Now, when we look at the data, we go through it, and HTTP GET was one of the biggest pieces of the puzzle, but as you can see here, application-based attacks only accounted for 3% of the overall attack volume for that quarter. This varies slightly from quarter to quarter, but the worst I've ever seen is it went up to 10%, and that was about 6 months ago. And it's really actually amazing that we don't see more of that. Not encouraging them, just really interesting when you look at the data. And when you look at the data, this is where I go back to talking about the source, talking about raw data versus what we've gone through in Massage. This is actual raw data, and we're going through it, and based on countries, and I don't know if you can see it on this is a bit of an eye chart. Sorry? Oh, I'm feeding back on myself. There we go. Weird little sound well up here. Sorry?
I was checking out NolaCon.
Oh, no worries. All right, so when you're looking at the source countries for web attacks, 56% of the source attack part of the countries was the United States in Q4 of 2015. And this really comes into an interesting focus when you look at the top target countries. The United States came in at 77%. This really evokes the image of Nelson from The Simpsons just going, stop hitting yourself, stop hitting yourself. And I don't understand why this is such a prevalent problem in the United States. There could be something that I'm missing, or it's entirely possible that attackers are just routing through IP addresses in North America. That's one of the reasons that I put that caveat that we just have the raw data. We haven't gone through to that level of granularity digging into it yet. But what we have done is we've parsed it out based on industry verticals. Now, when we're looking at the various industry verticals, it's really interesting to note that retail is by far the #1 attacked vertical of them all. Whereas in years gone by, finance was definitely the #1. And when people were attacking finance, they're actually after financial data, records, credit card numbers, all the rest of it. And as financial institutions got better at securing their platforms, fewer and fewer people were going after these platforms because they said, okay, it's getting harder and harder. I have to go after something a little bit easier. Who has this same kind of data and is not nearly up to snuff that we're seeing with financial institutions? Retail. So attackers have been coming after retail and more as well, going after hotels in various places. And a perfect example of this, there was a hotel booking site in Europe. This is roughly a year, maybe 2 years ago, called Elephant or something to that effect. No, Hippo. Sorry, Travel Hippo. This site was really interesting because you could actually increment. There was a unique identifier in the URL. If you changed it by a factor of 1 up or down, you get somebody else's booking details. And rather than fix the problem when it came to light, the company just went out of business. So when you're looking at these sort of things, you have to understand that if you're not doing a good job of securing your own platform, you could go out of business like that. And this was a great example of that. And I may be getting the name wrong, but I'm fairly certain it was something to that effect. And when the attackers are going after this sort of financial data and they can't get at it, they can always flip to a different method. Now, one of the really interesting methods, and that has been around for quite some time, but has really risen to prevalence in the last year, is the extortion-based attacks. These are the folks that will come after you and say, hit your site with X amount of data, send you an email saying, we're going to attack you, here's evidence in your logs, pay up, or we're going to knock you off the internet. And they did go after quite a few sites in 2014 that were documented, such as Feedly, Meetup, and Basecamp. And the interesting thing is whenever they made their extortion demand or the ransom demands for these particular attacks, it was very low. It was always in Bitcoin. It always amounted to somewhere between $80 and $150 US. It really struck me as odd. And as we went through and looked at the natural progression of things, we realized that this was an organization that was trying out their new monster. And they became known as DD4BC. Whether by their own moniker or ours, I don't remember how that actually came into being, but these were folks that would attack sites for money. And unfortunately, a lot of folks that didn't have protections in place actually did pay the ransom. And the problem that I see here is that in so doing, they managed to create a precedent. And by creating that precedent, they say, oh, okay, we'll attack more sites. And as this sort of information found its way into the media, all of a sudden you have copycat groups popping up. These guys were somewhat audacious. Here's an example of an email, and unfortunately I'm fairly certain nobody can read that from that particular screen, so I'll just read it off here. It says, allow us to introduce ourselves first. They would put 3 different articles, and this would vary from email to email, for news sites, and saying this is describing who we are, or just Google DD4BC. They had gotten to that point where they had gotten so sure of themselves that they were willing to say, oh, just Google us and you'll see how it is. And if you don't pay us 30 Bitcoin, we're going to attack you. This is a legitimate actual email that went to one of our customers who was protected. So they didn't have a problem. But the email really resonated with me because what if you're a mom and pop shop or a small and medium business that's running and doesn't have any sort of protections in place? This could be the end of you, theoretically. Now, more recently, these attackers, this particular group has sort of gone to ground a bit. But they were claiming between 400 and 500 gigabits of traffic as their attack platform. The reality of it was more around the lines of just under 50 gigabits per traffic. But that in of itself is still enough to take out quite a lot of sites. But it didn't end well for one of the key members of the group who just this past January or December, a little bit fuzzy on the dates, was actually captured by Europol and is now cooling his heels in a prison. And the really interesting thing is that a lot of people were like, yeah, we got one. Oh, great. This is going to be the end of them. It's like, no, actually, this is just the start. Because they see, yes, they got caught. The attackers learn how they got caught, and they adapt and move on. It's one of the things that we collectively need to do a better job of, is learning from our own mistakes, learning from our own past data, and saying, how can we do a better job of this? The attackers do a great job of this. So now we see more organizations popping up that are doing the same sort of thing, but they're getting better at keeping their mouths shut. Even to the point where we saw one particular group, Armada Collective, which would threaten, but more often not, they wouldn't launch an attack. And then in the media just a couple weeks ago, it came out that they actually never attacked anybody of any size or shape, but people would pay up anyway. They made about $100,000 just by threatening companies. Now tell me that is not incentive for somebody living in, say, a former East Bloc country that's sitting around at home trying to figure out how they're going to make a career for themselves. Oh, we got method, we got mode, we got opportunity. Sorry, go ahead. Wow. I haven't seen them go after schools before. Wow.
Yeah, so that was kind of different for me, but yeah, they got ransom, they were going to
Now the question is, did they pay?
I don't remember, I had messaged my friend that's the director of network services over there, because I figured she was tapping my head.
True.
But apparently all they did was very big in backup, so they just went back to the previous day's backup and essentially deleted the ransomware off my system.
Awesome.
But I've been meaning to message her for more details. This is the first one I've ever seen them go after
And yeah, same here. I've never seen them go after school. I've seen them go after hospitals with the ransomware that we saw in California. Unfortunately, they paid the ransom. And just thank you for that. Northeast Independent School. I'll make a point of looking that up. And that's a perfect example of just because you're attached to the internet, you become a target. And it's not fear, uncertainty, and doubt. It's that you have a number associated with your organization. And what are the attackers doing? They're winding through the IP address blocks, and they're eventually going to get to you. And when they do, they're going to launch any sort of amplification attack. And this is the easiest one and also the most prevalent one, as I was talking about earlier. And a lot of this is wrapped around NTP, SNMP, DNS type based amplification attacks. And a lot of this is our own faults as defenders. And why do I say that? Because, for example, with NTP, if it is not updated to current, if your daemon is not updated to current, it is potentially a reflector. If your SNMP is not updated to current, it's potentially a reflector. DNS misconfigured, same problem. And as we can see, going from the right side of this screen, from the top to the bottom, is quarter over quarter. We can see the amount of the volumetric-based attacks is increasing as we go along. And it is just getting easier and easier for attackers to launch these things because we haven't been exercising proper website hygiene or proper system hygiene in general. They're leveraging on our mistakes. How long does it until somebody says, well, wait a minute, you didn't properly configure your systems, you were a part of the attack, so your cyber insurance is now pulled. It's not there yet, but it's a possible scenario. So why are these attacks getting bigger and bigger? A lot of what I see is the barrier to entry is dropping. It is getting so simple. Now, tools I'm going to show you here are admittedly a couple of years old, but they get the point across. Havage, this is a great little tool for doing SQL injection. I set up a lab at my office, and I used this tool a couple of years ago. It was frightening how bloody simple this is. Click, click, next, done. You have just popped the system. And you know that uncomfortable moment when you realize your slides are out of order? Awesome. Anyway, so I'm not going to talk about Donut. I'll just jump ahead. Anyway, sorry. Donut is another example of a tool that is literally you put in the site you want to hit, you pick the port and go. And that was how simple it was. Now this here is an eye chart that shows the requests coming across the wire. And this is the type of information that you would see as a defender in your logs. It is very simple. There's really nothing here to distinguish it as being that particular tool other than the absolute volume of the attacks. So apologies for missing that screenshot. But anyway, tools that make it as easy as well as, for example, is Hulk. Hulk, this was from 2012, so it's a few years old. But the reason I love putting this one in here is because of the name, is the HTTP Unbearable Load King, which wasn't exactly all that unbearable, but again, this was very similar to the Donut, and again, it was based on HTTP GET requests. And again, we see the type of information that would come into your logs. This isn't all that different from a normal web request in a lot of ways. And as you're going through it and you're looking at this, it's simply based on the volume. So you have to adapt how you're actually dissecting these sort of things. Because the tools are getting simpler and simpler. Case in point. We all know that there's anybody in here not familiar with this one. This is the low orbit ion cannon. This was put out by one of the anonymous groups at some point a few years ago. And it was crowdsourcing a denial of service attack. And going back to the disposable workforce, it was using that disposable workforce to do their dirty work for them. They would each get one of these tools, they would launch it, and on an assigned date, they would all fire them up and all point at a target and go, boom, attack. The problem here is this tool did absolutely nothing to obfuscate the point of origin. So a lot of folks got themselves in a lot of trouble with law enforcement because they had fired up this tool, and wait, they were under the age of 18 in a lot of cases, and well, suffice to say, it didn't end well for a lot of them, but you can see that this one has a lot of configuration options, but later on, we got the high orbit ion cannon. I'll give them credit for the names, they're pretty amusing. But in this particular case, they've actually reduced the amount of configuration needed down to a button that is fire the lasers. They could configure this with different types of what they call booster packs, which would change the attack type. And again, you have a crowdsourced denial of service attack, but at no point is somebody saying to these kids, you really should look at a better way of doing things. This is why this is a bad thing, because you could get yourself in some serious amount of trouble. If you can just get online, Google, you can be attacking a site in mere minutes. That's really unfortunate when you look at it from that perspective. One of the really interesting tools that I've seen through my work is dealing with Brobot. And Brobot, as I was talking before with the Al-Qassam cyber fighters, this was an excellent tool that was built using compromised WordPress installations. And we all know how secure WordPress is. I've been running a WordPress site for over a decade, and oh, the headaches it's given me. This tool was very good at launching denial of service attacks, and when they would launch them, they were fierce. There was a lot of nodes, and it's still, for all intents and purposes, it's still out there, although it's not being leveraged by any attackers at this point in time. It's only a matter of time before somebody actually gets a hold of that one. Now, to flip it on its head, one of the things that drives me crazy is when the media gets a hold of a tool and says, this is an attack tool, and then all of a sudden you have talking heads in various governments saying this is an attack tool, we should ban it. This was actually a case that happened a couple of years ago where they were going on about how wget was a hacker's tool and it should be taken away. It's not. It's very much like a hammer. I can build a house or I can bash you about the head and neck with it. It doesn't change the fact that it's a hammer. But the thing is, you have to look at the intent. What is the intent? And this is why I worry about if people are going to legislate all of these tools into a criminal existence, how are we ever going to get anything done? Because all the attackers, pretty sure they don't care. Now, as we go through all the data, it's really interesting to see all the different types of trends that we see developing out of this data. And we've only just begun. We've been doing this for about a couple of years now, and we've really only started to scratch the surface on the volume of data that we have available to us. So hoping to be able to provide better reports going forward, which again are free to everybody. And I'll talk about that more in a little bit. One of the things that really jumped out was the media grandstanding that was being done by various attackers. Case in point, the Lizard Squad. They were very good at getting themselves arrested. There was one case where two of the folks that I self-identified as being part of the Lizard Squad did an interview where they were doing an interview with either British or Australian television media. Their faces were blurred, but at no point did it occur to them that this was an incredibly bad idea. Suffice it to say, they were incarcerated soon after this. And this is something that we see more and more. If you look back in the days of, the early days of attrition, All DOS, Zone H, and things like that, people would compromise sites because they could. They would say, greets to my peeps and all that sort of thing, and it would put it up on a, screen capture of whatever it happened to be. There was no motivation other than the hey, look at me factor. Now, there is a lot of money to be made. And the grandstanders like to make a lot of noise because there's money to be made for them as well. And that comes in the form of the commoditization of distributed denial of service. Bit of a mouthful, but when you look back to all of those platforms that were doing simple site discovery protocol that were easily being added as denial of service tools, these and other types of nodes across the internet can be conscripted into botnets. These botnets can then be harvested into a platform where they can actually sell services to an end user to be an attacker. So rather than downloading a tool and launching it, you can now use a platform. Now, about a year ago, Lizard Squad came out with a platform which was actually built on another group's software called Titanium Squad, or Titanium Crew. And now Titanium Crew's platform, they got the software from them. How? Don't know. If it was given to them, purloined, whatever it happened to be. But when they first set it up, they set it up so badly that we were able to download all of the users and their unique identifiers. They didn't even figure out how to put htaccess files on it. So they're very good at getting in front of cameras, but they were not doing a very good job of securing their own platform. But the part of it that really got me was how they would break it out. This is an actual screenshot from the Lizard Stressor platform that they put up. And it gives you the various packages, and unfortunately I probably can't read it, but I'll tell you the one in the bottom right corner here is 7,200 seconds for $69.99 a month, or $280 lifetime. And well, with a platform like this, I wouldn't go in for the lifetime deal. Call it a hunch. Now, with this particular deal, if you take $69.99 divided by 30, average a month, then you're looking at $2.33 a day. Now, to put that in context, how many coffee drinkers do I have in the room? Oh, yeah, you're lying if you didn't put your hand up. Now, if you look at a Starbucks Americano Grande, $2.55. For less than a cup of coffee a day, you could be knocking sites offline using this cloud-based platform. Really amazing to think how things have come. Now, somebody pointed out to me when I gave this talk at Interop this year that what if they're actually onto a business model? Admittedly, these sort of platforms did exist back in the 90s where you could actually do load testing on your sites. And I used one at one of the financial institutions I was at, but it wasn't meant as an attack tool. Now, these folks are using all kinds of interesting language to cover that up, and I'll get to that in a second. So one of the things that these platforms use is a booter. And a booter is actually born out of the gaming platforms. And if you have somebody that you're angry at because they're getting a higher score, you could actually use this particular tool, a booter type of tool, to knock them off. And it's really interesting that in addition to that, it would end up taking out other people. And it was really an annoying piece that as you progressed, you also found these platforms were adding stressors, which goes back to what I was talking about a moment ago, where these were legitimate platforms back in the 90s. But now, as an attack tool, they call them a stressor because it's a legal artifact. And by calling it that, they're going back to the days in the 90s where these were actual platforms that were used and saying, oh, well, we're just giving the platform, we're not actually doing the attack. And I would say that they should really seek actual professional legal help because this is not the way it works out. And there's all kinds of these platforms out there. This is just a sample list. And this is by no means an endorsement of any of them in any way, shape, or form. But as you go through the list, one of the ones that really caught my eye was the Big Bang Booter. Why? Because it made me giggle. So these platforms, you can pay Bitcoin for all of them to use them to attack however you see fit. But Big Bang Booter, while we were doing our research, my coworker and I found a video. Hopefully this works. Yes. This is a remarkable video in that it goes through and it provides all kinds of information about their platform. It provides about the types of attacks. Let's see if I can do this without setting off the speaker. So it does, oops, custom source, goes through to, there we go, tells you can hit like a boss. There's a reason I'm letting this run for a second, because there's a piece that about a minute in that absolutely cracks me up to no end. Not this, but this is funny, untraceable servers, and we all know how well that works on the internet. 8 different types of attack methods. Call now. Here it is, 24/7 friendly support. This is how audacious they've become. And then I really thought back to what the person at Interop said to me, said, are they onto a business model? I thought, they may well be, actually. There could be some legitimacy, because you look at bug bounty programs today. Bug bounty programs are legitimate. A few years ago, that would not have ended well. And some other highlights that, I'm going to drive him crazy. I'm going to wander around. As we're going through this, we're looking at the different types of things. We're seeing a lot of SQL injection attacks, and more of these attackers are going out of their way to build out their platforms so that they can offer these as services. And one of the biggest problems that we saw are data breaches fueling further attacks. And when I say that, we see all of these usernames, we see all of these accounts that are getting dumped out and then being run against other sites in hopes of breaking into Amazon, Apple, whatever it happens to be, so they can actually take out gift cards in your name, things like that, and make some money. All right, so let's see if I can get by the speaker again. Free, good. All right, so attribution is something that I have a huge problem with, especially when you look at the whole North Korea Sony Pictures thing. I really have a deep and abiding suspicion about that one, but that's a whole other ballgame. So when we present the data, when I present the data in this particular case, it is just raw data. There is no effort to go through and vilify any particular character. Okay, so now before I was talking about top 10 sources for web-based attacks, this is top 10 sources for DDoS attacks, and primarily based on volumetric attacks against infrastructure. And go figure, China came in at number 1. But this was a really interesting departure this particular quarter because Turkey jumped to 22% of the overall attack traffic. And this coincided, strangely enough, with the downing of the Russian fighter jet in Syria. So we don't know if this was a relation, but it was an interesting correlation when you look at the timestamps, and they almost reflected exactly based on the source attack. And when we see the types of attacks that come across our platform, this is a perfect example of one attacker against one of our customers, and they were alternating their attacks, alternating their attack volumes over a course of the month of December, trying to get through and trying to knock down the site. And it really shows that this particular attacker went up to over 309 gigabits per second on one particular day, December 30th. Did not end well for them, but. And this here we look at the frequency attacks based on industry. And when you look at the frequency, gaming is by far number 1. There's a lot of pissed off teenagers with access to the internet. And as we go through these, we look at the DDoS attacks as a function of time. If we go back to Q4 of 2013 up to Q4 of 2015, and then we plotted them out based on the number and the volume going from right to left, left to right, new day. You'll notice one thing that has really caught my attention is that it goes from a light spackling all the way over to a darker smudge on this side. And it's not too much of a stretch to think that in a couple of years, that's just going to be a solid black bar at the rate we're going, because the number of these attacks is increasing quarter over quarter. And it really shows that it's getting easier and easier to attack people. Other observations, I go back to this over and over again. SQL injection. This is a solvable problem. And when we're going through this, we look at the different types of things, malicious file uploads, Java, and I think Java is actually one of the most maligned, mismarketed things in the world. It is an excellent remote access platform. Marketing loss. And SQL injection, like we were talking about earlier, has been around for over a decade, at least documented over a decade, and this doesn't have to be the case. It just won't die, and I don't know why. And the reason that I have a real problem with this, and as we all should, is because it ends up badly for the people getting attacked. This is data actually pulled from a site called Data is Beautiful, and it's a graphical representation of attacks over the last part of probably last year. That's a lot of records that have been popped because of various reasons. They're not all SQL injection-based attacks, but a good part of them are. And when we're looking at these types of attacks and going through them, we also look at remote file inclusion. And one of the things that we found was this thing here. There was a slider. There was a WordPress plugin called RevSlider. And RevSlider, if you've ever been to a WordPress site where you see the images changing randomly, this is one of those plugins that could do that. And they'd had a SQL injection problem that allowed for this sort of attack where that you would have a shell on a WordPress installation where you could leverage other types of attacks. Kind of neat in of itself, but when you look at it, this is the kind of thing that the attackers were using to get into these systems. Look at the CVE dates up here, 2009, 2012, 2008. This is data from last year. These are old problems that should have been fixed, but we're still stuck cleaning up the mess. Now, if we're not doing good website hygiene, we really run the risk of becoming part of an undead army. We have all of our systems that we're responsible for, but if we're not paying attention, we're not doing the most, unglamorous thing of looking at log files, we're going to miss these sort of things, and we're going to become part of the problem. So what can you do? Well, ignore that first line. Of course, you know a vendor that can help. But SQL injection is a solvable problem. We really have to go back and look at data ingress and egress and make sure that we're not allowing this to happen. We need to do a better job of hardening our systems. For example, the travel site that I was talking about earlier, we were able to increment based on the record. That shouldn't happen. If it was tested properly, that never would have happened. Look, work with your ISPs. If you have a site that is not currently in the cloud and you're still doing a traditional hub and spoke architecture, the ISP is your next hop up. In a lot of cases, they may have mitigations that they can help you with or ideas to help you better secure your systems. And most importantly of all, patch your systems. This is by far the leading big problem that I see out there is people don't do a good job of this. People love to get fascinated with a zero-day attack. This is a problem. Oh my God, it's this, it's that. But what about the patches you didn't apply from 6 months ago? Oracle patches, perfect example. And when we're going through this, we look at these stories about 0 days and we go, oh, wow. But then the data ghost has to come in and say, no, stop that. We really have to look at the information. A lot of these attacks are happening, the successful ones, based on deprecated systems that aren't properly patched or whatever it happened to be. We need to do a better job as defenders. Now, all of this data that I've been pulling here, well, a lot of this data that I've been pulling from, is actually available, that we make it freely available to whoever wants to read it, in our State of the Internet report, which comes out every quarter. And a lot of this information is available because of a lot of my coworkers that work in their CERT team and various other research functions within Akamai. And this is a t-shirt that they were giving out at Hack Miami last week, so I couldn't resist but throw that up there. Now, with all of these smart people, incoming vendor angle, we're hiring. So, if you're looking for a job, be sure to come look me up or check us out online at akamai.com. And that being said, I really do appreciate you all taking the time to sit here and listen to me prattle on. And I'd like to thank the folks at NolaCon and all the volunteers for having me here. That being said, anybody have any questions? I put you all to sleep. Okay, one question or I dance? All right, that works. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.